The 6th of August, 1945, a blinding flash of light, a fireball hotter than the sun. In an instant, over 80,000 lives were erased, a city turned to ash. The world had entered a new age, an age of destruction beyond imagination, and at the center of it all was one man. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant physicist, a tortured genius, the father of the atomic bomb, the man who gave humanity the power to destroy itself. He was hailed as a hero and condemned as a villain. He changed history forever, and lived long enough to regret it. But how did he do it? And did he ever truly recover from what he had created? To understand, we must go back to where it all began. The story of J. Robert Oppenheimer does not begin with war or destruction. It begins with a boy brilliant, curious, and destined for greatness. Born in 1904 to a wealthy Jewish family in New York, Robert Oppenheimer was different from other children. He had an insatiable hunger for knowledge, a mind that never rested. By the time he was 10, he was already studying minerals and chemistry. By 12, he was writing letters to famous scientists, asking questions that most adults wouldn't even think to ask. He was a child prodigy, but with genius came loneliness. Socially awkward and physically frail, he found comfort not in people, but in books, in equations, in the infinite mysteries of the universe. Harvard was his proving ground. He excelled, finishing a 4-year degree in just 3 years. But his mind was too vast for just one institution. He traveled to Europe, to Göttingen, Germany, where he studied quantum mechanics under the legendary Max Born. There, he stood at the forefront of a scientific revolution, rubbing shoulders with minds like Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr. He was no longer just a student. He was shaping the very foundation of modern physics. But while Oppenheimer was unlocking the secrets of the atom, the world around him was spiraling toward chaos. The 1930s were a time of rising fascism, of war looming on the horizon. In 1939, a single discovery changed everything. German scientists had split the atom, nuclear fission, a process that, if weaponized, could create an explosion unlike anything the world had ever seen. And if the Nazis got there first, the consequences would be unimaginable. The fear was immediate. Scientists like Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard realized what was at stake. They sent a desperate letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt warning him that Hitler was on the brink of developing an atomic bomb. The United States had to act hand fast. This letter would ignite one of the most ambitious, secretive, and world-altering projects in human history. And at the center of it was J. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who would become the architect of destruction. But how did this quiet physicist, a man who had never even built so much as a bomb in his life, end up leading the most dangerous scientific project in history? To answer that, we need to step into a world of secrecy, espionage, and a race against time. Because the Manhattan Project wasn't just a scientific endeavor, it was a war for the future of humanity itself. The world was at war. Hitler's forces had swept across Europe, and Japan had brought the United States into the conflict with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The race for nuclear supremacy was no longer theoretical, it was a matter of life and death. The United States could not afford to fall behind. In 1942, the US government launched the Manhattan Project, a secret military operation with one goal: to develop the first atomic bomb before Germany could. It was the most ambitious and dangerous scientific effort in history. Billions of dollars were poured into research. The best scientists in the world were recruited. The stakes could not have been higher. But who would lead this effort? The project required someone who could bring together the brightest minds, manage an unprecedented level of scientific collaboration, and oversee a technology that had never existed before. Strangely enough, the man chosen for the job was not a military commander, nor a weapons expert. He was a theoretical physicist, a man who had spent his life studying abstract equations rather than explosives. That man was J. Robert Oppenheimer. To many, his appointment seemed absurd. He had never built a weapon in his life. He was known for his sharp intellect, but also for his absent-minded nature, his poetic musings, and his radical political views. He had sympathized with communist ideologies, opposed fascism, and surrounded himself with left-wing thinkers. He was in many ways an outsider in the world of government and war. But Oppenheimer had something that no one else did vision. He understood not just the physics of the atomic bomb, but the philosophy behind it. He could see what others could not. He could unite minds, inspire creativity, and push people beyond their limits. His charisma, his intensity, and his sheer genius made him the natural leader of the Manhattan Project. With the government's blessing, Oppenheimer built Los Alamos, a secret city hidden in the deserts of New Mexico. Here, the greatest scientific minds in the world gathered in secrecy, cut off from their families, working day and night to unlock the mysteries of nuclear fission. Men like Enrico Fermi, Richard Feynman, and Edward Teller, all brilliant, all driven, all consumed by the mission. But this was no ordinary scientific endeavor. The scientists were not just theorizing about equations on a blackboard. They were building a weapon capable of ending civilizations. As the months passed, the pressure intensified. Every day brought new breakthroughs and new failures. The race against Nazi Germany was relentless. The fear that Hitler might already have an atomic bomb loomed over them like a shadow. Yet, despite their progress, there were whispers of doubt. Some scientists began questioning the morality of their work. What would happen if they succeeded? Would this weapon truly bring an end to war, or usher in a new era of destruction? Oppenheimer himself wrestled with these thoughts. He was a man of contradictions, both fascinated and horrified by the power they were unleashing. He understood that once this weapon was created, there would be no turning back. Then, in April 1945, the war in Europe took a sudden turn. Hitler was dead. Germany surrendered. The Nazis never completed their bomb. For a moment, the scientists at Los Alamos considered stopping. The threat they had feared was gone. But the war was not over. The Pacific Theater raged on. And the US government had no intention of abandoning the bomb. Now it would be used against Japan. And the moment of truth was coming. The 16th of July, 1945, Trinity test. Oppenheimer and his team had spent 3 years building the world's first atomic bomb. Now it was time to see if it worked. They took the bomb nicknamed the Gadget to a remote desert testing ground in New Mexico. The countdown began. The tension was unbearable. No one knew exactly what would happen. Some feared the explosion would ignite the atmosphere, setting the entire world on fire. Others believed the test would fail. Then a flash of light brighter than the sun. The fireball rose into the sky, turning night into day. The shockwave rippled across the desert, shattering windows over 100 miles away. The mushroom cloud climbed over 7 miles high, towering over the landscape like an unnatural force of nature. The first nuclear explosion in history. Silence followed. The men who had worked tirelessly for years to build this weapon stood in awe and horror. They had done it. The atomic age had begun. Oppenheimer, staring at the blinding light, uttered the words that would define him forever. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." A line from Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, a reflection of his deepest fears. The bomb worked, and now it would be used. The world was on fire. World War II had reached its peak, and the fate of nations hung in the balance. The United States was now fully committed to the war effort, and military leaders understood one thing: technology would determine the victor. In 1942, the US government launched the most secretive and ambitious project in history, Manhattan Project. The goal was simple yet terrifying: to build the first atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could. It was a race against time, against uncertainty, against the very nature of science itself. Billions of dollars were poured into research. Laboratories were established in remote locations, guarded like fortresses. Thousands of the world's greatest minds were recruited. Scientists, engineers, mathematicians, all working under absolute secrecy. But in the midst of all this, a question remained. Who would lead the project? Who could bring together the brightest minds, push science beyond its limits, and deliver results under unimaginable pressure? J. Robert Oppenheimer was an unexpected choice. He was a theoretical physicist, not a military man, not a weapons expert. He had spent his life immersed in the world of quantum mechanics and cosmic phenomena, ideas far removed from war. And yet, it was Oppenheimer who was chosen to direct the effort. Why? Despite his lack of experience with weapons, Oppenheimer had something far more valuable: vision. He was not just a brilliant scientist, he was an intellectual force. He had a way of bringing people together, inspiring collaboration, and seeing beyond the immediate obstacles. He understood that this project was not just about science, it was about shaping the future of the world. And so, in 1943, in the deserts of New Mexico, Los Alamos was born, a city that did not exist on any map, hidden away from the public eye, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. It was here that the best scientific minds of the era gathered, working in secrecy, pushing the limits of physics to achieve the impossible. Among them were legendary figures Enrico Fermi, Richard Feynman, Edward Teller, and many more. But Oppenheimer was the unifying force, the man who held it all together, the one who made sure that every calculation, every experiment, every breakthrough moved them one step closer to their goal. The pressure was relentless. The Nazis were rumored to be working on their own bomb, and every moment wasted meant the possibility of Germany winning the nuclear race. But as progress continued, so did the doubts. Some scientists began questioning the morality of what they were building. Was this truly a weapon of necessity, or were they unleashing something far worse than war itself? Oppenheimer himself was conflicted. He was a scientist first, fascinated by the mysteries of the atom, by the sheer power locked within it. But deep inside, he knew once this power was unleashed, the world would never be the same. Then, in May 1945, the war in Europe took a sudden turn. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. The enemy they had feared, the one they were racing against, was gone. For a brief moment, there was talk of stopping the project. The very reason for building the bomb no longer existed. But the war was not over. The Pacific was still a battleground. Japan had refused to surrender, and the US government had no intention of abandoning the bomb. Now, the atomic bomb would not be used against Nazi Germany. It would be used against Japan. The work at Los Alamos continued, but now with a different weight on their shoulders. This was no longer about beating Hitler. This was about what came next. And soon, the moment of truth arrived. The 16th of July, 1945. The Trinity test was set to take place, the first detonation of an atomic bomb in history. The world was about to witness the birth of a new era. Oppenheimer and his team had worked for years, but no one knew exactly what would happen. Some feared the explosion would ignite the atmosphere, destroying the planet. Others believed the test would fail. But there was only one way to find out. The desert air was still. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then a flash of light brighter than the sun. For a fraction of a second, night turned into day. A fireball hotter than the core of the earth erupted into the sky. The shock wave rippled across the desert, shattering windows over 100 miles away. The mushroom cloud climbed over 7 miles high, an unnatural force of destruction unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Trinity test had succeeded. For a long moment, no one spoke. The scientists, the engineers, the military officers, they stood in silence, watching as the dust settled, as the landscape before them transformed into a charred wasteland. Then, slowly, a new kind of realization set in. The world had changed, forever. Oppenheimer, standing among his colleagues, understood what had just happened on a level that no one else could. He had spent his life studying the mysteries of the universe, uncovering the secrets of the atom. And now, he had turned those secrets into a weapon powerful enough to wipe entire cities off the map. At that moment, words from the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture, surfaced in his mind. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Those words would define him for the rest of his life. The bomb worked, and now it would be used. Just 3 weeks later, President Harry Truman made a decision that would change the course of history. On the 6th of August, 1945, a B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The explosion erased 80,000 lives in an instant. The city was engulfed in flames. Shadows were burned into the ground. Radiation poisoned the air. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, 1945, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Another 70,000 lives were lost. Within days, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. But for Oppenheimer, the war within himself had just begun. The bomb had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had ended the war. But at what cost? Oppenheimer was hailed as a hero, but he did not feel like one. The weight of what he had created was crushing. He had given mankind the power to destroy itself. He had opened a door that could never be closed. And he knew this was only the beginning. Because if one nation had the bomb, others would want it too. The arms race had begun. The Cold War was on the horizon. And the same government that had once celebrated him would soon turn against him. Oppenheimer had won the race for the atomic bomb. But what he didn't realize was that he had also started a new kind of war that had no end. And soon, he would go from being America's greatest scientist to its greatest threat. The war was over, But J. Robert Oppenheimer was far from at peace. The world had changed in an instant. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been obliterated, hundreds of thousands were dead, entire cities reduced to ash, and a new era had begun, the atomic age. As the world celebrated victory, Oppenheimer stood apart, watching the aftermath of his creation unfold. He had led the most ambitious scientific project in human history, had built a weapon so powerful that it had forced an empire to surrender. And yet, as he listened to the reports coming in of the radiation burns, of the shadows burned into concrete, of the survivors suffering in ways never seen before, he realized something chilling. He had not just created a weapon, he had changed the very nature of war itself. For a moment, he was hailed as a national hero, a genius, the man who had helped end the war. President Truman invited him to the White House. The press called him the father of the atomic bomb. But Oppenheimer did not feel like a father. He felt like a man who had given humanity a power it was never meant to have. His mind was tormented. He could not celebrate like the others. He could not ignore the consequences of what he had done. And when he finally met with President Truman, his emotions got the better of him. Looking into the eyes of the most powerful man in the world, Oppenheimer spoke the words that would seal his fate. "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman was furious. He saw Oppenheimer not as a hero, but as a weak man, a scientist who had done his job and now regretted it. After that meeting, Truman called Oppenheimer a crybaby scientist and never invited him back. But the truth was, Oppenheimer was not weak. He was not breaking down. He was waking up, and what he saw terrified him, because he realized that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just the beginning. The bomb had changed everything. But now, the question was, who would control it? And more importantly, what came next? Oppenheimer thought he had built a weapon to end all wars. But instead, he had started a new kind of war that would never end. And soon, he would go from being America's greatest scientist to its greatest liability. The world had barely begun to understand the power of the atomic bomb, but already a new race had begun. The United States was no longer the only country with nuclear ambitions. The Soviet Union was watching. They knew what had happened in Hiroshima. They had spies inside the Manhattan Project. And soon, they too would have the bomb. Oppenheimer saw what was happening and tried to stop it. He had helped build the first bomb, but he was determined to prevent something far worse, the creation of a new generation of nuclear weapons, weapons even more powerful than the ones that had already devastated Japan. He spoke out against the development of the hydrogen bomb weapon that would make Hiroshima look like a firecracker. He warned that the US and the Soviet Union were heading toward a future where war would no longer be winnable, only survivable. But Oppenheimer had made powerful enemies. Men like Edward Teller, a fellow physicist, believed that America needed to continue developing its nuclear arsenal. More bombs, bigger bombs, stronger bombs. Teller and others accused Oppenheimer of standing in the way of national security. And in the rising tension of the Cold War, that was a dangerous position to be in. Worse still, Oppenheimer had a past that could be used against him. Years before, he had associated with left-wing political groups, some of which had ties to communism. During the war, these connections had been overlooked. After all, he was building a bomb for America. But now, with McCarthyism and anti-communist paranoia gripping the nation, these old associations became ammunition against him. In 1954, Oppenheimer was summoned before a security hearing. It was a public humiliation, one of the most brutal interrogations in modern history. He was questioned about his political beliefs, his past friendships, his loyalty to the United States. He was forced to defend himself against accusations that he was a traitor. Edward Teller himself testified against him, saying he did not trust Oppenheimer to guide America's nuclear future. And in the end, Oppenheimer lost. His security clearance was revoked. The man who had once been at the center of the most important scientific project in American history was now exiled from the very world he had helped create. He was no longer allowed to advise on nuclear policy, no longer trusted by the government he had once served. And just like that, J. Robert Oppenheimer, once the most powerful scientist in America, was silenced. He had given the United States the ultimate weapon, but in the end, that same government turned its back on him. Oppenheimer had been erased, but what he left behind would never be forgotten. J. Robert Oppenheimer had been cast aside. The man who had built the atomic bomb, who had changed the course of human history, was now a man without power, without influence, without a voice. Stripped of his security clearance, shunned by his former colleagues, he found himself an outsider in a world that had once revered him. But he was not just an outsider, he was a warning. Because the very machine he had helped to create the nuclear arms race, the Cold War tensions, was now spiraling out of control. Oppenheimer had once believed that the bomb would end all wars, that its sheer power would force nations to choose peace over destruction. But in the years following Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the opposite had happened. Nuclear weapons had become the new currency of power. The United States and the Soviet Union were now locked in a terrifying game of brinkmanship. Both nations were building bigger and more powerful bombs, testing them in remote locations, flaunting their destructive capability in an escalating battle of intimidation. And Oppenheimer? He watched in horror. He had created a weapon meant to prevent war, yet now the world stood on the edge of a war that could destroy civilization itself. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The United States responded not by pursuing peace, but by creating the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Oppenheimer opposed it. He argued that this new weapon was beyond military necessity, that it was not just a deterrent, but a tool of genocide. But no one was listening. The government that once depended on his intellect now saw him as a threat to national security. And so, he withdrew. Banished from political influence, he turned his attention back to science, to academia, to the pursuit of knowledge beyond destruction. But his shadow still loomed over the world. And the question he had feared most was beginning to take shape. Had he doomed humanity? The nuclear arms race had begun. The world was more dangerous than ever before. And Oppenheimer, the man who started it all, could do nothing but watch. The world was moving forward, but Oppenheimer was frozen in time. By the 1950s, he had been erased from the nuclear discussion, his influence dismantled, his name tarnished. But history does not forget its greatest minds. Despite his political exile, Oppenheimer remained a legend in the scientific community. He continued his work in physics, lecturing, writing, and shaping the minds of the next generation. Yet, even in his silence, his legacy could not be ignored. In 1962, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before. The Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 terrifying days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of nuclear war. The world held its breath as the two superpowers inched toward a confrontation that could have wiped out millions. It was exactly what Oppenheimer had feared. A war that could never be won. A war that would leave no victors, only ruins. And yet, in this moment of unprecedented danger, the world finally listened to the warnings he had spent years trying to deliver. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended not with war, but with negotiation. The realization was clear. Nuclear weapons could not be used. They were no longer just weapons, they were the end of civilization. For the first time, nations began to talk about control, about limitation, about treaties to reduce the spread of these world-ending bombs. Oppenheimer did not live to see the full impact of these changes. But in his final years, he witnessed the world taking its first steps toward nuclear responsibility, a fragile, uncertain step toward ensuring that the power he had helped unleash would not destroy humanity. In 1963, nearly a decade after his public disgrace, the U.S. government made a quiet attempt to repair the damage. President John F. Kennedy approved a decision to award Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award, a prestigious honor for scientific achievement. It was not a full redemption, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition that despite his fall from grace, Oppenheimer's contributions could not be ignored. By the time he received the award, his health was failing. Years of stress, guilt, and exile had taken their toll. And on the 18th of February 1967, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, took his final breath. His work had changed the world forever. His name had become synonymous with both genius and destruction. And even in death, his story was far from over. Because the world he left behind was still living under the shadow of the bomb. Oppenheimer had built the weapon that defined the modern world. But his greatest fear had always been the same, that one day someone would use it again. And that fear still lingers today. J. Robert Oppenheimer was gone, but his creation remained. The world he left behind was forever changed by his work. Nuclear weapons were no longer just instruments of war, they had become symbols of power, tools of diplomacy, and constant reminders of humanity's ability to destroy itself. The Cold War raged on for decades after his death. The arms race escalated beyond anything Oppenheimer could have imagined. The United States and the Soviet Union stockpiled tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, each capable of reducing entire cities to nothing but dust. And yet, they were never used. Because the world understood, just as Oppenheimer had, that there could be no winners in a nuclear war. For all his regret, for all the pain he carried in his final years, Oppenheimer had given humanity a warning that it could not ignore. The bomb was more than a weapon. It was a threshold, a line that, if crossed, could mean the end of civilization itself. And because of that, the world began to change. The birth of nuclear responsibility. By the late 1960s, world leaders began to recognize the dangers of unchecked nuclear proliferation. Treaties were drafted, discussions held, agreements made to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968, a global effort to prevent new nations from developing nuclear bombs and to encourage nuclear disarmament. This was Oppenheimer's influence, even in death. Though he had been pushed aside, though he had been cast out by the government he had once served, his ideas still shaped the course of history. He had warned of a future where nuclear war would become inevitable, and because of that warning, nations stepped back from the edge. But the bomb could never be uninvented. It would always exist, always be a shadow over human civilization. And to this day, the question remains, was Oppenheimer's work a gift to humanity or a curse? His name is still spoken today, studied in classrooms, debated by historians. Was he a hero, a villain, or something far more complicated? To answer that, we must look at what he left behind. More than 75 years have passed since the first atomic bomb was detonated. The world has changed in ways that even Oppenheimer could not have predicted. But his legacy remains as complex as ever. Even today, his name is spoken in classrooms, in scientific discussions, in military strategy meetings. He is remembered as both the father of the atomic bomb and the man who feared what it had become. Some see him as a tragic hero, a man who unlocked the power of the universe only to regret what he had done, a scientist who wanted to prevent catastrophe but instead brought humanity to the brink of it. Others see him as a necessary figure in history, a man who did what had to be done, a man whose work ended a world war and prevented future ones. But one thing is undeniable. Oppenheimer's legacy is not just about war. It is about knowledge. He was more than just the father of the atomic bomb, was one of the greatest scientific minds of his time. His work in quantum mechanics, black holes, and astrophysics shaped modern physics. His contributions to theoretical science stretch far beyond nuclear weapons. And yet, he will always be remembered for one thing. For the words he spoke after witnessing the first atomic explosion. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. A man who had once sought to understand the universe had instead created the most powerful weapon it had ever seen. And that contradiction, that moral weight, would follow him until the end of his life. Even in death, his presence looms over the modern world. Every time a nuclear treaty is signed, every time world leaders speak of deterrence, every time a missile is tested in some distant desert, this shadow is there. And the question remains, just as it did the day the first bomb was dropped. Did J. Robert Oppenheimer save humanity? Or did he seal its fate? He changed the world forever, but the world is still deciding what that means. Was he a hero or a warning? That is for history to decide. J. Robert Oppenheimer was a man of contradictions, a scientist, a philosopher, a patriot, and a man haunted by his own creation. He gave humanity the ultimate weapon, but he also tried to stop it from being used again. He was celebrated, then cast aside. He was called a genius, a hero, a villain. But more than anything, he was a warning. The world still lives under the shadow of nuclear weapons. The very technology he helped create remains one of the greatest threats to human civilization. The Cold War may have ended, but the bombs have not disappeared. Nations still test them. Leaders still threaten them. The power to destroy cities, to end millions of lives in an instant, still exists. And the question he asked in his final years is still the question we must ask today. What will we do with this power? Will we continue to live in fear of it, or will we find a way to control it, to ensure that the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki never happen again? What do you think? Was Oppenheimer a hero who ended World War II and prevented future wars? Or was he a man who gave humanity the power to destroy itself? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story fascinating, wait until you hear about another man whose work changed the world forever, Nikola Tesla, the scientist who invented the future.